When I first played many years ago, I got a Gibson A model mandolin, which I thought sounded really good. It was a nice little mandolin, but then I had a chance to play a Gibson F5, a Lloyd Loar, Lloyd Loar was a acoustic engineer, worked for Gibson in the early 20s, and he basically was in charge of mandolin production at that time. And his instruments are worth so much money now because they're the, they were the pinnacle of their of excellence, and every mandolin now is kind of modeled after those. Well, anyway, I had a chance to play one of these instruments, and I thought it sounded terrible. I didn't quite, at the time, I'd only been playing less than a year, and I didn't have, I was using probably a thinner pick, and an A model with a round or an oval sound hole will sound better if it's played lightly. But something with F holes, like this is a I don't know if you can see this mandolin.
Yeah, that's good.
This is an F5 from an F7 from the 1930s and 1937, and these mandolins respond to more of a heavier touch, in a more aggressive technique. And if you do that, they have an incredible sound, and they can, that's why they're used in bluegrass. They're basically the backbeat percussion instrument.
Right.
And so at the time, my technique wasn't very well developed. So when I picked this thing up and tried to play it, it just didn't sound good. I didn't. It was almost like it was such a fine instrument. It had a disdain for my.
It was making fun of you.
It was making fun of me. It said, no,
yeah, you're not ready for me.
You're not ready for me yet.
This hurts.
But then as you play an instrument, you kind of generally find the sweet spot in it. Whether it's an inexpensive one or a really good one. You can generally find where the tone is on it if you look for it.
Yeah, that's neat. Back to this one for a second, because the tops they were using were probably red spruce.
They were.
Then, right? So that's another thing
point.
that's really different than what they use now.
That's a very good point. And Martin stopped using Adirondack, or what's called red spruce, for the tops. And this is the most important component probably for guitar sound, is the quality and type of top material. And they just stopped using it. There's a number of things they stopped doing in the 1940s. One where they stopped using scallop bracing, and they went to straight bracing about late 1944.
Any idea why that was?
I think this was response to players using heavier strings, and people were sending their guitars back for repairs a lot because they were pulling up the tops and things. So they started reinforcing them. It was to try and make the guitars more robust. But back to the red spruce, about 1946, Martin switched to Sitka spruce, which it's a nice wood for guitar tops, and most guitar tops are made of Sitka spruce now. But a lot of players, and kind of myself, I kind of ascribe to this too. I think that there's a pretty significant difference between Adirondack and Sitka spruce as far as sound. Adirondack is just more resonant and more responsive, and you can still get it. It's not like Brazilian rose where we just can't get it anymore. It's just expensive. The trees don't quite, they're just not as numerous. You have to be careful of the way they're cut, and it's just harder to get. But that's one thing Martin did stop using, and now they're building guitars again with Adirondack spruce. A lot of their models do.
As a custom thing, or
well, a lot of their standard models have it now. Because people want it, and it's still around in sufficient quantities where people can actually, but it does add to the cost of an instrument. Like, I'm not sure exactly, but it can, a guitar with an Adirondack spruce that's otherwise identical can be several $100s more.
I was going to say, I think most builders,
a,
like if we asked Ed Claxton to build a guitar or something, and we wanted Adirondack, it could be $300, $400, $500, $600 extra.
It would, yes. It is more expensive, and it's characterized by, you can't see it on this video, but an Adirondack top will have, the vertical grain on it is very defined. It has characterized by lines that
really easy to see.
Are really easy to see, and it's generally, when it's new, it's a different color. It's like a more, it's got more of a honey shade to it. But it's so most players can look at a top and go, oh, this is Adirondack as opposed to Sitka. But I had it's not always, it doesn't always hold true. I had a 1947 D28 that had a Sitka top, and that thing was just, had an absolutely unbelievable tone. It just, so it's all kind of subjective, really. It's not, But in general, Adirondack tops are what people want guitars made out of these days, especially when they're looking for a really good instrument, you know.
Yeah.
And Martin is recognizing that, and other builders are starting to use it again, but it is expensive because it is, you know, not as common or easy to get hold of as Sitka spruce.
Yeah, yeah.
But you know, it's. But gosh, I mean, I could probably bore everyone to death with all the details of what, you know, changed in these guitars. Generally, the most highly regarded Martin guitars were made in the 1930s. The dreadnoughts from the 1930s. You know, when the 14-fret dreadnought came into existence about 1934.
Right.
And they became rather successful. You know, at the time there was a lot of jazz and big band, and it was sort of an alternative sound to the archtop guitar.
Yeah,
so
more volume and sustain and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because back then you had to compete with horns and other loud instruments, and also people who were, country music was sort of starting out, and a lot of singers they couldn't afford to hire a bass player, so they wanted a guitar with a lot of bass. And you know, these generally,
yeah,
you can really get sort of a bottom end. It just adds a fuller sound. I mean, for fingerstyle stuff, I mean, you can play it on these, but generally fingerstyle players prefer a smaller guitar, like maybe an OM size, or a guitar like Neil's, where this is more of a smaller body, where it really brings out the mid-range and the high range. It's very, very balanced. These tend to be more bass-heavy, and you don't really, if you're doing solo fingerstyle guitar, you don't necessarily need a really heavy bass. And then they started getting into things like to get to the higher registers, the cutaway, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a Koa guitar, I can tell.
This one is, yeah.
That's actually, oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wood that it only grows in Hawaii.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, probably some other tropical places too, like Tahiti and, you know, places like that. I think, I'm not sure, but I know it grows in Hawaii. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's similar in tonal characteristics, more similar to mahogany than it is to rosewood. You know, because it's probably even genetically related somehow to or closer to mahogany. But yeah, stunning red and figures in the you know.
Yes, I've seen figured mahogany. It's pretty rare, but occasionally you see a guitar that has quilted or figured mahogany in it, and it resembles Koa more than, you know, regular mahogany. Most mahogany. It's interesting to me that most mahogany, especially on Martin guitars, you can, from any era, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it looks mostly like it was cut from the same tree.
Yeah, it's pretty consistent from one to the next.
So more similar in appearance than any wood I've seen.
Yeah.
Whereas rosewood has more figures and striations, and there's different ways depending on the way it's cut. Will have a different grain. It's just more defined. But Koa is interesting. Martin made some guitars out of Koa during the 1920s, mostly when Hawaiian music got very popular.
Right.
And they were building ukes. Some ukes out of Koa and some guitars, but I think it was kind of not well managed environmentally, and I think a lot of the Koa disappeared for a number of decades because it was sort of there wasn't much more to use. So now you're seeing it more because it's coming back. But at that time, I think it was pretty well logged out.
Yeah.
But it would have been interesting to see what a Martin guitar made in the 1930s with the construction techniques they were doing then would have sounded like with Koa back in size.
Yeah.
Would have been an amazing guitar.
Yeah. You know, I did an interview, or I sat down with Richard Hoover at Santa Cruz Guitar Company about a year or so ago and put some of it up at Totally Guitars. And I have more I have to put up, but in one of them we talk about when they first started, they were building all their guitars out of Koa. And they weren't building rosewood guitars. So the first 100 Santa Cruz guitars were all Koa. And maybe not the first 100, but a lot. But in the beginning, so the first guitars of theirs I saw were Koa, and that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. You know, it's in the late 70s. And it was, I can't even remember his exact answer now as to why they were doing that, but it was sort of a fluky thing. Part of it was they were poor guitar builders, and Koa then was cheaper than rosewood.
Yeah.
And so they could afford to buy some Koa, and they could nowadays. Koa is, again, a $500 to $1,500 upcharge on a hand-built guitar over rosewood, over Indian rosewood.
Yes, Indian rosewood, that's another thing. Martin switched in the late 60s, or 1969, somewhere in the middle of the year.
Yeah.
They switched from using, for their rosewood guitars, Brazilian rosewood is what they used since they started building guitars in this country in 1833. It was always Brazilian rosewood. Then in 1969, they switched to Indian rosewood, and they kind of thought it was similar enough to nobody would know the difference.
Or care.
But people knew, even back then, we knew there was a big difference between the 1969 guitar and the 1970 guitar. Even back then, people were thinking about Brazilian rosewood. You know, it actually has a more attractive appearance, and it sounds better. It's just generally a better sounding guitar than Indian. You know, it's again subjective. I've played some great sounding Indian rosewood guitars, and